Oh, why am I so excited? I'm excited because I have my old friend Steve Cohen. I've known Steve since, we'll find out, I think he was 15 when I met him, something like that. And now he's a magician to kings and billionaires and everybody in between. Wonderful person. If you don't already know Steve Cohen and his show Chamber Magic and his new book we're going to talk about, you're about to find all that out. Here he is, the great Steve Cohen. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Hey Dave, nice to see you. It's been
And
a
you're
long
coming
time.
directly from your home, your performing home in New York, the Palace, the Lot Palace. Is that right? We're already frozen. We just started, and now the picture is frozen. This is not
Yeah,
good.
I'm frozen.
You're
Shall we?
back.
Great, there we go. Can you hear me okay? I,
Yeah, we'll leave that in. I leave it all in, the warts and
no
all.
problem, no problem. I was petrified being in your presence.
Of course. How old were you? I met you and Mark Sisher up at Tannen's
That's right. Yeah,
Jubilee.
I was maybe 14, 15 years old, and
Yeah.
I know that Mark, was just enamored by you and your magic, and then he was telling me you've got to meet Dave Williamson, and we just we kind of became a pair of sycophants around you.
Well, no, I met, and then I saw you many times over the years, growing up in
Sure.
magic and doing so many things in your career. And then, what was it? 20 years ago, you started Chamber Magic.
I started in 20. No, sorry, I started the show in 2000, so it's been running for
Okay.
22 years,
Amazing.
minus the pandemic, so that's a year and a half
Yeah.
off. So the show's
Yeah.
been running for over 20 years now, and it's
When you're
over
doing something
6,000
for 20
performers.
years and you're forced to take a year and a half off, what does that do to your family life? Does your wife go a little nuts with you in the
Oh,
house?
everyone went crazy. Yeah, the whole family, and we got a dog that changed everything.
Even the dog growls. When you're like,
Yeah,
why
he's
did
like,
he
"What
go
is this man
away?
doing on Friday nights? Why is he here?"
Yeah. We
No,
do
but
things
it
when you're
really did,
gone.
you get a rhythm. You know what it's like, Dave. Like
Of
you
course.
get a rhythm of your life when you have a performance schedule, and for 20 years of a performance schedule, you can't just break that or you snap. So I went a little bit crazy, just not knowing what to do on weekends, and was getting depressed and kind of sullen. And after a long period of kind of soul searching, I said, I'm not going to do any online shows. That's
Yeah.
not for me. But I am going to put some of my thoughts about Max Malini into print. That was something I knew right from the get-go that I was going to put my effort into. So if not for the pandemic, we would not have
This beautiful, beautiful
this
book. I mean,
massive
I do
book.
love the cover design. Did you have a hand in that, or did you just give it
Yeah,
over to an
100%.
artist?
So basically, what happened was I found an artist who works with playing card design, and that was
Ah,
pretty cool.
yeah, there you go.
There you
Whee!
go. So I
Lovely,
found an
lovely
artist who works
design.
with playing card design, thanks to my contacts with Theory 11. Theory 11 makes my tycoon cards.
Exactly, yeah.
And
Beautiful
so I
designers
asked them
at
if he
Theory
would help me
11,
find
right?
an artist who understands the idea of Victorian style books, something like Robert Louis Stevenson or Jules Verne or one of those classic books, or even
Of course.
in magic, something
Yeah.
like a Professor Hoffman book.
A Hoffman
And
style
so
book, of
I
course.
contacted this artist who lives in Siberia. I never met anyone from Siberia before.
What?
And he said, "You want a Victorian style book?" And he came back with 3, 4, 5 different options. And they were all beautiful. And this is the one that I helped him tweak and try to figure out how to make it look
Good for you.
just,
Well,
just how I wanted it.
all of us, a lot of magicians are bibliophiles. We covet these books as objects, as sacred objects. And I mean, it ticks all the boxes.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I
Your
hope
design.
that people realize it's not just a beautiful object.
Well, of
but,
course
it
not.
actually has a
Once you
lot of
crack it
content.
open,
It's
once
a
you
year and a
crack it
half
open,
of- Yeah, it's a year and a half of my life, which is basically, in between these pages of writing, but 20 years or more of research.
this is amazing. I mean, we are going to talk about this book because let's just jump right in and talk about it. My introduction to Max Malini was through the Ganson book,
Right.
Vernon's sort of tribute. But then Ricky Jay kind of filled some of it out with a little more, personal stories. But you really put flesh on this person and turned him into a real person and filled in all of the blanks. Molini was this, mythical figure to all of us for so many years. And the stories of Molini came down through Vernon and Charlie Miller and Fawcett
Right,
Ross
right.
and the magicians who saw him and also, Leipzig and his contemporaries. but then they're filtered to us through Roger Klaus and John Carney and Mike Skinner, and then by the time they get to us with the telephone game, it's a mythical figure. What did he really do? What was he really like? And you've detailed all of that out.
Right.
It's
I mean,
amazing.
what I did was, over the years, I've just kept files and files of information about Molini. Some files had to do with his life. Some files had to do with his family life. Some files had to do with his magic tricks. Some files had to do with these crazy stories that we hear about of his performing, making the pork chop appear from inside of a hat. So, all these stories were just in various folders, like physical folders. I've been keeping Xerox copies of things. And then as the internet became, obviously a better resource, I decided to start doing some serious research, not only into the newspaper articles that were in the Library of Congress, but then I realized, well, there's many, many more library resources that are available around the world. They're, of course, all paid resources. So the Library of Congress is free. Anyone can go on there. And if you went into the Library of Congress website, you typed in Max Malini magician, you'll find probably hundreds, if not 1,000, different instances of his name in print. But then I thought, okay, well, what about when he was performing in England? What about when he was performing in Japan? What about when he's performing in Indonesia and
China,
in Australia and New Zealand? And I started going into the databases for all the newspapers for each of these countries.
Oh, wow.
And then for the Japanese ones, since I speak Japanese, I translated all the Japanese articles from Japanese into English and found out how did Molini during World War I perform for the Japanese public, even though he couldn't speak a word of Japanese.
This is a fascinating story because in the book there's a story about Kimura Molini. Basically, talk about this real quick. There's so many great anecdotes from his life, so many wonderful stories that read like fiction, but these are true to life stories. Although you take some of the accounts that have been massaged and ghost written and you bring them down to earth and make Molini a real person, which I really appreciate.
That was the idea. I wanted to make it so that we understand Molini. Of course, he's a hero. He's a legendary name. But he was a guy. I mean, we talk about his, his marriage life, which was not good, and he was a wife beater.
Surprise.
And got divorced, and he was divorced by his wife. We talk about his alcoholism, and about his obesity, and I mean, he had so many problems. But he also, at the same time, traveled the world 8 times.
Absolutely.
When the only way you could travel the world was on train and by boat.
Yeah.
So that's extraordinary to me.
It's
right?
extraordinary for a guy who did close-up magic, basically.
Was carrying a bunch of suitcases and just traveled the world, and then ended up not performing for only the public, but also for kings and queens and emperors and rajas and czars and billionaires of the day.
Of course.
So anyway, when he was in Japan, and I remember I lived in Japan for 5 years, but I've been speaking Japanese for 25 years. Actually, I take it back, 35 years now. So when he went to Japan, he needed an interpreter. Now remember, he doesn't understand a word of Japanese. So he got an interpreter who didn't understand a word of English. But neither of them knew that. I mean, well, he didn't know that the interpreter didn't speak English.
Okay.
So he did his act, and this interpreter was basically just coming up
making
with
things up,
funny phrases and funny lines, and
because he was a public speaker, right? He was you said he interpreted silent movies.
He was
in
a
Japan.
silent movie narrator.
So
what he also did is he scammed his own. Basically, he scammed the owner of the theater, because the theater owner didn't understand that this guy Kimura didn't understand English. So he was doing his own monologues for the movies, but they were nothing to do with the actual content.
He was as bold as Molini in his own way.
He really was. He had balls of steel.
Yeah.
So what I like to say is that it was the blindfolded leading the blindfolded.
I laughed out loud when I was reading that portion of the book. I could just imagine it. Very funny.
Well, the funny thing is, so then Molini was performing his act, and this interpreter Kimura was standing on the side, and he basically learned Molini's entire act.
Right.
After Molini then left Japan, and he went back and forth to Japan 8 times, but when he was gone, Kimura Molini, who took Molini's name, then said, "Oh, by the way, I'm actually the disciple, the official disciple of Max
Because
Malini."
as you explain, in Japan, even to this day, there's a master-student relationship where
Correct.
the student would take the master's name,
Right. So, if, for example, all of your Slide School, students would be called, something Williamson.
We continue that even though we're not in Japan. I make them do that.
You should brand them with a branding.
There's a brand. Well, there's a brand. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. That's for the
I have a Sharpie with a little brand on it. They don't know that they've been stuck with it.
that's for the deluxe edition, right? That's for the deluxe membership layer. So in any event, so yes, there is a disciple relationship, master disciple, and most people would take the name of their master. So this guy Kimura took Molini's name, unbeknownst to Molini himself.
Yeah, he kind of skipped that step where
He skipped the middle step, and then he went out and started performing Molini's act plus a couple of his own things, and circled the country performing to great acclaim.
Very popular.
Some of the shows lasted for 3 to 4 hours.
Well, I can relate.
Right,
to
this is a different era. It's definitely a different era. People had
exactly.
much more.
Well, I went to Kabuki Theater once, and Ton Onosaka. I made the mistake of mentioning out of the blue, oh, someday I'd like to see Kabuki. Kind of being kind. I didn't even know what it was.
Right.
And into the
see
fifth
Jeffrey
hour, I'm sitting there by myself in this nobody went with me. I'm in this audience. About hour 5, I was regretting my.
Right, yeah. People are
slip of
yelling
the
out
tongue.
onto the stage, or yelling out the names of the actors and whatnot. Anyway, yeah, it's a long act. So this guy Kimura Molini became quite acclaimed and quite known amongst magicians. He never tipped his hat, saying that he never, was officially ordained by Molini himself.
Right.
And Molini, when he came back, was never told. So I think there's a photo of the two of them standing right near each other.
Right.
And it's like it must have been some side eye going on, but he had no idea. Molini had zero idea.
Funny.
He was being aped.
Why was it? What drew you to Molini?
So, when I was a kid, growing up in New York, I was, drawn to magic like almost everybody here. I was definitely not a great athlete. I was a short guy. Wasn't very personable, just trying to figure out a way to make my way. And when I was in college, I read this book, the book by Ricky Jay, which you probably read.
Yeah, Learning Pigs, Fireproof
and
Women.
Fireproof Women. And I saw the chapter in there that Ricky had written about Max Malini, the last of the mountebanks.
Yes.
And I read this, and something resonated with me. Here's a short Jewish New York guy who came from nothing, and my parents were school teachers. I wasn't born into wealth. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to perform for the elite of society doing close-up magic. And I thought, that's the gig for me, because
his story
I'm a
spoke
short
to you.
New York Jew,
I mean, yeah.
and I do close-up magic, and I'd love to be able to enter that society. So something clicked, and something just kind of there were some neural passageways that were hardened and firmed up. And I just, as many people know about my career, I started performing here and there for wealthy folks, and for the Rockefellers, and for billionaires now, and royalty and whatnot. And I was fortunate to be able to find some people who had access to Molini's, I would say, more stories that we hadn't heard before. I was ending up on stages that he had performed on.
From inside that society, that kind of
and then
cloistered society.
One time a man came up to me after a show and he said, "I'd like you to have this," and it was Max Malini's business card, and he was a nephew of Molini, and he said, "I'd like you to have this. You would be the perfect person to have it." And that was the beginning of my obsessive collection of Molini materials. I think that no one has more Molini material in content than me. Copperfield has some great stuff, but I've got more, and I've just been kind of collecting it over the years. Mostly printed material, because there are some people. I know someone who has Molini's knives, the one that cling to your finger.
Sure.
Right. So I know someone who Ricky Jay had a suitcase, and a bunch of other people have some other memorabilia
props,
objects.
yeah.
But of the different props. But most of Molini's props, you have to remember, were not even props.
Right. He didn't have set of rings or cups he always used.
Cups and balls that
exactly.
were sterling silver, right? He would just
Sure.
go and get some coffee cups, or he'd get some tumblers and wrap them up in newspaper, like in Stars of Magic, and perform the cups and balls impromptu. Which, think about it, when you can do that type of magic, that's what Ricky Jay was talking about. The greatest test of a magician is, can you do magic with anything? Can you make something from nothing? And I really think that's a great phrase of what a magician does. We make something from nothing, and Molini personified.
You go backwards in time, and through these people we talk about, Skinner to Vernon to Charlie to back to Molini. I mean, it was Vernon and Charlie revered Molini, right? And they tried to disseminate some of his lessons. But as you say, Today, we all buy the cups and balls. Somehow it's become very cozy. We keep our props in a velvet bag, and we have all these specialist sort of routines that. But it was a very bold style, and as you said, it was magic with anything, anytime, anywhere, and that's how he created a legend for himself.
Right. Well, this is the funnel that Molini created. He had kind of a funnel for his career, and the funnel was that he would go to a town. When he entered the town where he didn't know anybody, he would go to the fanciest hotel. He would check in. He would introduce himself to the general manager, and he would show this gigantic scrapbook full of articles he had.
The scrapbook, right.
Exactly, a scrapbook full of articles that would show where he had performed and the kings and queens that he had entertained. Then, using that information, he was able to secure a hotel suite or some sort of a ballroom where he could do a large-scale show later on. Now he had to get people to buy tickets to that. So the next stop was always going to the newspaper office, where he would then do another show, impromptu, for
right there for the editors. He'd walk right into the newsroom.
Exactly, right to the newsroom. Another spot he would often go to is the press club. If there was a local press club where all the other, in other words, rather than going to one newspaper, go to the club where all the newspaper guys hang out. And this way he'd be able to hit all of them at once. So it was very clever. And so that was the opening of the funnel, was he had to be able to do magic with anything he found in any environment. So if he was in a newspaper office, obviously he'd have a newspaper handy, so he could tear off a piece of the newspaper and do the coin fold vanish inside of a newspaper square, right, and tear it up and shred it and make it disappear. And if he's in a bar performing, let's say, at the press club, then he had to have a whole bunch of bar tricks. So in the book, what I tried to do was show the funnel of his magic. So the book starts, of course, there's the biography section, but with just the tricks, there's 300 pages of tricks.
It's fantastic, yeah.
The opening part of the trick section is all of these impromptu tricks that you can do with things anywhere.
And the pattern repeats itself over and over.
Do a whole bunch of card magic, so there was a whole section on cards, and eventually he would invite people to come and see his real show, which was on stage in the ballroom. However, by almost all accounts, his best magic was at the top of the funnel, not the bottom of the funnel.
Right.
So his real, he was able to make the sale, but he wasn't always delivering on the promise.
Right. Kind of like Houdini in that way. Houdini was a great, kind of pitchman for himself, but the shows themselves, the stage show wasn't always the thing. It was the stunt,
right.
The publicity stunts, yeah.
And it was also just creating the legend. I think that part
That's
of
it.
Molini's, his intent was, I'm going to create a legend that will precede me. So that when I come to a town that I don't know anyone, my name will have gotten there before I did. And remember, he didn't put up big posters like Carter and like Thurston and all the big magicians that we know who were in the golden age of magic. He had, I think, one major poster and one smaller poster, but they only got used sparingly for one or two shows in Australia. And
would that be one of them?
That's one. That's the main one. That's the one that was at auction recently at Ricky Jay's auction.
You didn't get it?
I was the underbidder.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah, I mean, it was the final sale on that was $70,000.
Oh my gosh. There's great stories of throughout the book of things like he would. Vernon was in his hotel room and he said, "Get that pack of cards out of the drawer," and he opens the drawer. And there are paper straws from 15 different hotels, because back then they would print the name of the hotel on the straw. So he would have extra straw paper. He'd be loaded for bear. He walks into any hotel, he'd stick a couple straws in his pocket, so he's one ahead always.
Exactly. So yeah.
And you say he'd leave wax or daub under bars and tables throughout the different cities, so that if he ever comes back to that club, he knows he has a piece of wax under that counter over there where he can grab some.
So what I like to think is that he was basically seeding the world with gimmicks and with revelations. So he kept a notebook of all the different cards that he had planted in different cities and different locations and different hotels around the world.
Sure.
So for example, let's say I go back to the Hotel St. Francis in San Francisco, right behind the pendulum of the grandfather clock, there's going to be a Queen of Diamonds, right? With a blue back deck. So that would be in his notebooks. The next time he goes, imagine the power that you feel walking into that hotel, knowing that your revelation is there, because no one's gonna clean behind the pendulum of the grandfather clock in the lobby, right? I mean, it would be very rare. So the odds are then you can force a Queen of Diamonds from this matching back deck spring the cards at the.
But the
grandfather
salesmanship,
clock, and
the story
boom,
you
the
tell
fortune
is like
there.
somebody says, "Show me a trick, Molini." He goes, "Okay, but let me get a drink first," and he orders a drink that requires a straw.
Right.
Knowing that
He
he's
was
going to
a
be doing this.
diabolical con man. I think he was like a long con.
Well, that's it. He
artist.
played the long game all the time,
Yeah.
right? There's a
And
great
that-
story
and
about
the-
Fred
the brilliance
Capps.
of it, though, is that it always appeared as if it were completely
Yeah,
impromptu.
that's exactly the genius of it, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
And you
So, yeah,
recount
so
a couple
that's-
stories that you have that where you've kind of emulated that. I like the violin string story.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you that. So one of the things that Molini did was the cut and restored ribbon or the cut and restored rope on his stage act. But one time he was out at a social gathering and he saw some fishermen who had some fishing line, and he quickly went under the table and sliced off with his knife a small piece of the fishing line, passed off to his assistant, Eddie McGuire, the magician
Yeah.
you might know from Phantom of the Card Table. He took that fishing line, the assistant did, curled it into a nice loop, sealed it off, and now he was able to do his cut and restored rope with a borrowed fishing line.
Right.
So think about that. It's like he walked up to the guys and said, "Going fishing, boys?" And they're like, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, let me show you something." And you pick it up and load the extra piece, and
Yeah.
boom, right, and restore their fishing line. It's extraordinary. You can't beat that. Well, one time I was in Munich, Germany, and I was doing a show with Anne-Sophie Mutter, one of my good friends. She's a great violinist, one of the best who's ever lived. She has 2 Stradivarius violins. She's let me play one of them.
2.
I don't play the violin, so for me it was a scratch.
She's got the worker and she's got a backup, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty much like that. It's like it's like a backup magic wand. But like I said, that was for me. It was a Scratchavarius. It was terrible when I played it.
Yeah.
And so after her concert in Munich, we had this dinner party after, and I had found in the dressing room, because I was in her dressing room afterwards, in the trash there was an extra broken violin string. I think it was an E string. And so, thinking fast, I was thinking about the fishing line
Yeah,
story.
the fishing line story.
I crafted it into a loop and added it into a little pull or holdout that I had. And after dinner was over, I said, "Hey, Anne-Sophie, do you?"
You steer the conversation, right?
Making conversation, kind of steering it my
Yeah.
way. I was wondering, do you ever have?
Well,
a
that's the
situation
genius.
on stage
So it
where-
wasn't like, let me show you a trick. Do you have an extra violin string? It wasn't that. You get the conversation about how often do you break
Right, 'cause
strings.
it was all
and-
musicians there too, so everyone
Yeah,
had their own
talk-
stories.
they were
right?
all
Everyone's-
talking shop,
The
yeah.
cellist is telling his story. The violist is telling her story.
Yeah, you're setting the
violinist player
stage.
tells her story about when she was playing on stage. She said, "Oh, the audience loves it when a string breaks because that means that they know that I'm putting all my effort into it, and I'm playing with all my vigor." So I said, "Oh, this is the perfect time to introduce." I said, "Well, you know something? Do you happen to have a violin string with you right now?" And I knew she had it because her Stradivarius was right underneath the table. So she said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "Well, take out one of your strings." And she took it out. In the meantime, I'm getting my holdout ready. And I happened to have a knife with me, so I cut it in half, sliced it, and said, "This is just like it is on stage, but wouldn't it be wonderful if it were possible to put your string back together again in front of your audience and continue playing?"
And,
And
yeah, go
they
ahead.
went crazy. The whole table
They went crazy, right?
haywire.
And how do you act at that point? Do you go self-satisfied,
that's
or
the
do you
thing.
go
So
dig
Molini
back
is
into your
great.
moose and act like it's no big deal?
You just as if nothing happened. It's
Yeah,
just,
right.
Because the moment they know that it was a big setup, then you lose the
Exactly.
buzz, right?
Well, that's the joy in it.
I think the key is to either pretend like nothing happened, or excuse me, I need to go get a drink, and just walk away from the table.
Yeah, you got to drop the mic.
Let
at
them
some point.
enjoy that moment.
Right.
And sometimes Molini did this. This is great. So the vanishing tobacco. Okay. So
Yeah.
he would take a cigarette, open it up, pour the tobacco into his hand, squeeze it. The tobacco all disappears. Everyone's very surprised. He then walks away. He just leaves the table. Goes around, does a couple of things. Goes to the bar, goes to the bathroom, whatever he needs to do. The audience at his table now is just sitting around going, "I have no idea what just happened. Where'd that tobacco go?" Then maybe about 20 minutes later, he'd come back to the table. And people say, "Molini, where'd that tobacco go?" He goes, "Look under the ashtray." And on the table, there was an upside down ashtray, which, by the way, had the tobacco there all along.
Yeah.
So he could have, right after he vanished it, picked up the ashtray and shown that the tobacco was there. But it's a better effect dramatically to leave and let them stew in that moment.
Well, in
And
the
then come
book,
back
you
and let
mentioned
them-
that. That's, I believe, what I think it was Leipzig or somebody said he had incredible patience. That was one of his greatest assets was his patience.
He had patience. He definitely had patience. I mean, like all of these effects that we're talking about with seeding the world, with cards and other sorts of blow-offs, that takes an immense amount of patience and control, right? It's like you can do a trick right away, but you wait till the right moment. And of course, the famous expression is wait a week. How long do you wait? You wait a week. And I always
tell that story, because maybe somebody watching here, we have some young people maybe who don't know this famous.
No problem. I'm happy to explain it. So Max Malini was in Los Angeles. He was with, I think this is in the late 20s, early 30s. He was with Charlie Miller, great card man, great magician, incredibly knowledgeable, and very funny and quirky man. And did you ever meet Charlie Miller?
I did, yeah.
I never had the chance to.
Oh.
In any event,
he was living in Johnny Thompson's garage at the time.
yeah, he lived in everyone's garage. Apparently.
Yeah.
America's house guest.
Yeah.
So he was with Molini, and Molini actually was much closer with Charlie Miller than with Vernon. In fact, Ozzie Molini one time said that Vernon was a pest to his father.
I bet.
He's always like trying to get a little bit more information.
Sure.
He wasn't having it. In any event, at one point, Molini was doing the side steal and was practicing it. And at one point, Charlie Miller says, "How do you know when to perform it?" And Max Malini says to Charlie Miller, "It's all in the eye." And he didn't understand what that meant, right? Because he didn't go any further and kind of expound on that. Really, what it meant is you don't perform it when they're looking down. You perform the move when they're looking up at you.
Right.
And how do you get people to look up? Well, you can engage them. You can ask them a question. You can, make some sort of profound statement that makes them startled. There's many different ways that you can get someone to look up. But the key then is you have to be able be willing to wait. And so that's what Molini says. You have to wait, because he had a kind of an Eastern European accent. You must wait. And Charlie Miller says, well, how long do you wait? I mean, they might still be staring at your hands. They could stare at your hands for a long time.
Right.
And Molini famously said, you wait a week,
right,
if necessary.
Yeah, I remember reading that as a youth. We all read that little quote somewhere.
Classic Molini story, which is why, when we advertised my book, the phrase that we advertised was, the wait is over.
So what was Molini's, greatest asset? Was it his boldness?
Yeah, I think it was his, as we would call it in Yiddish
courage.
or in Jewish, we call it the chutzpah.
Well, you named a chapter.
Having brass balls.
Chutzpah, yeah.
Chutzpah. One of my favorite stories from that section of the book, which I was so happy to find. Remember, I read thousands of articles about Molini, and in the book we had to slash many of them. The book could have been double this length. And if you asked some of the editors, John Lovick was one of the editors, Noah Levine was one of the editors, Dick Hatch, Gabe Fahuri, everyone who went through this book, they're like, this is great, but it's just too long. Like, the only people who care about it really is maybe you. So, yeah, that's probably right. So I have so many photos and illustrations of Molini. They're not in this book. Are
you going to put them online or do a blog or some sort of extra?
I eventually will. I'll wait till the next pandemic.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that's
not
right around the
soon.
corner.
Yeah, exactly. Seriously. BA2, is that what it is?
Mm-hmm.
BA Baracus.
But you were about to tell a story about his chutzpah.
This is one of my favorite stories from the chutzpah section. So Molini was in London, and he was at a hotel, and he had a reporter who was supposed to come up to his hotel room and do an interview in the morning. So the interviewer comes to his hotel room, knocks on the door. Molini says, "Come in," and he's still in bed. He's lying in bed underneath the sheets. Must have been out late the night before. And the reporter's like, "I can come back if you like." He says, No, we'll do it now. And he says to the reporter, I'm not going to do the Molini voice because it's great. Okay. I have 2 shows tonight. It's going to kill me.
Yeah, don't do it.
So he says to the reporter, what are we going to talk about? He goes, well, that's up to you. He said, well, what are you going to take notes on? And the reporter says, I've got my notebook. He says, let me see that notebook. What have you written in there? And the reporter says, nothing. We haven't started yet. So Molini then says, let me see that. And he grabs the notebook and he flips through the pages, and it's filled with handwritten notes. Front page to back page. It's completely filled. He flips through it, shows everything's written. The reporter now is baffled because he just got that from his newspaper office. Brand new notebook. And then he said, well, what's the point of interviewing me if you already have all the information? Why don't you just leave right now? I don't need to go back to bed. And the reporter is baffled, and he goes, no, but you want to have an interview? Watch this. And he makes a magical pass, and then flips the same notebook, and now it's completely blank. And he hands it back. So how does something like this happen?
Right.
This is classic Molini, right? It's a global. And so what he did was he found in advance, they're giving the reporters all the same notebooks. So every reporter on the beat has the same
Standard issue.
notebook.